third year historians, and welcome to our next lesson for our National 5 topic on the slave trade. This one is looking at the structure and the economics of the triangular trade, so looking at where the kind of main stop-off ports were for the ships and what they carried and basically what they traded in these different spaces. By the end of this lesson, what you should be able to do is describe the different stages of the triangular trade, and you're going to use the next few slides to fill in a worksheet about that and a bit of information for notes in your jotter. So put the heading wherever you've decided you're taking your notes for this topic and continue the lesson. So basically, we have established that slavery had existed in Africa for a very long time. There were people who traded Africans between tribes. There were other countries that traded people as well as kind of servants, but we want to kind of think about how Britain actually got involved in this. Basically, this is all to do with one man, John Hawkins, who was a privateer. He left Plymouth in 1562 with about 100 men and 3 ships bound for Guinea, and pretty much what happened is when they got there they violently kidnapped about 400 Africans to sell as slaves. So he just took whoever he could find, having this bright idea that if the Portuguese were doing it, then why shouldn't the British? So you don't have to write this down, we just have to have a look at it. Between 1562 and 1567 then, Hawkins and his cousin Francis Drake, who was a famous explorer, made 3 voyages to Guinea and Sierra Leone, which we've highlighted on this map here that you can see, enslaving roughly between 1,200 and 1,400 African people. They then took these to the Spanish and Portuguese colonists, who obviously were in the Americas and had traded before with Africans. We're quite happy to do it with British people, with African people to trade as well, until the British settlements in the Caribbean and the North America areas grew. Once that happened, they began to supply the British colonies instead, and that became their main port of call, with British ships then going back and forward between the British colonies in the Caribbean, Britain and Africa as their kind of key points. One of the major things that we need to say about this topic, and when we talk about impacts of the trade we're going to look at in more detail, is the fact that this had a massive impact on Britain in a very positive way. Britain made a lot of money from the slave trade. It's probably one of the biggest reasons that it started and that it kept going for so long was the amount of money that Britain potentially could stand to make and the amount of money that they did make. However, slaves were not the only thing that was bought and sold on the triangular trade. There was a lot of luxury goods that were now available to the people of Britain, like sugar, tobacco, coffee, cotton, all of these things as well. The slave ships would come back with all of these goods, cocoa and things like that as well, which was used to make chocolate, and they were all in really high demand. So this was really, really important for the people at the time in Britain to become involved in. It meant that not only were the traders, the people who were actually taking the ships, making a lot of money, but actually also the people who were just general everyday people living in Britain were able to get better jobs and more money from their employment, which meant they had extra money to spend so they could buy these fine goods that were being brought in for the first time. People's standard of living really went up, and the slave trade had a massive impact on that. So the slave trade becomes known as the triangular trade, and the question for that is actually why. It's actually a really simple point. It's because there were 3 areas, 3 main points on this kind of trade route, so that ultimately what it made was a kind of triangular shape. You had ultimately Africa, the West Indies and Britain being involved, and it's because these 3 stages of this route, between Britain to Africa, stage 1, between Africa and the West Indies, stage 2, and then between the West Indies and Britain, stage 3, ultimately made up this triangular route. So we refer to these as the outward passage, so when we're going from Britain down to Africa, which is a red part here, this is the outward passage because we're going out. When we have then come from Africa to the Americas and the West Indies, we are going along the middle passage because it's the middle line of the slave trade route. and then when we have finished with what we're doing and we're leaving these areas to go back home to Britain, we're going along the homeward passage, and that is our 3-stage route. Out on the outward, along the middle in the middle passage, and home on the homeward passage. And these are kind of key points we need to know, but we're going to use a worksheet in a minute to fill in some more detail about this. So what you're going to do is you're going to find out more about the triangular trade, where the stops kind of were and what was traded on it. You're going to use the next couple of slides to help you complete a copy of the map. You might want to print it out and fill it in, or you can fill it in digitally and have it in your notes, or you might decide to just draw it out. It's entirely up to you how you do it. Obviously, if we were in school, we would print some and things like that. If you don't have a printer at home but you would really like it printed out, feel free just to either message me in the team or message your teacher in the team, or email, and I'll have a little stack printed of them put to reception for people to pick up if that's what you would rather do, and you can let me know about that. So we're going to use the next couple of slides to help you complete the map and kind of just fill in the details that we need. So these cards, normally we would do this as a find it around the room task, but these cards give you the information to kind of fill in on your map to tell you what you're kind of looking for. So Jamaica, small island in the Caribbean, was one of the main places where slaves were taken from Africa to work. The British traded various things with the African chiefs in exchange for slaves, including glassware and manila, which was obviously used for various purposes. Goods like sugar, coffee and rum were produced in the plantations in the West Indies, and these goods were transported back to Britain where they could be sold for quite a lot of money. So using these 3 cards, work out, is there any information in these 3 that you should put into your map, and decide where you're going to put it, and then move on to the next slide for the next bits of information. Many enslaved men, women and children were transported from Africa, and they came to countries such as the Congo and Angola. Trade goods such as tobacco, rice and cotton were also gained from taking part in the slave trade. These items helped Britain's industry and economy to grow, especially the cotton, because it could be used in a lot of factories in places like Liverpool and things like this. Most people who were taken from Africa as slaves were from countries on the west coast of the continent, which included Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast, which would be roughly about modern day Ghana. So again, have a look at the information that's on these 3 cards and decide where on your map these information bits would go, if any of it, and then move on to the next slide for the rest of the information. Okay, so the British traded various goods with African leaders in exchange for slaves, such as guns and ammunition, and they also gave them copper in exchange for slaves. The slave ships transported enslaved men, women and children from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean and American plantations. Barbados, which was a small island in the Caribbean, was one of the main islands where the slaves were taken to from Africa, and manufactured cloth and silks from Asia were used by the British in exchange for the men, women and children in Africa to transport to the Caribbean and the Americas as slaves. So again, decide any of this information goes onto your map, decide where it goes and fill it in, and then use the next slide to check your answers. So this is what your map obviously looks like, with some of your information kind of filled in. So if we click it, and we can see this part here, so we've got Great Britain, and we have the outward passage, which was obviously Britain / Europe to Africa, and that's the first stage of the triangular trade. On the outward passage you had things like guns, iron goods like shackles, pans, cloth, coins, copper, textiles, jewellery, beads, glassware, sometimes alcohol, and weaponry and things like that. These items tend to come from Britain. Some of the items had to be bought obviously elsewhere before they were taken to Africa, so like Britain needed to buy the cotton cloth from India before they then traded it with the African tribe leaders and things like that. Glassware and sometimes beads usually came from Venice and things like that, and they traded them in Africa at places like Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast. also the Congo as well. Angola was another place that they could pick up slaves from. So the trade goods we see here, and these should be the things that you're filling in on your map. After they've picked up slaves and they've gotten rid of all their goods, they then journey along the Middle Passage, which is stage 2 of the triangular trade, and they're heading for places like Barbados and other West Indian islands here, taking along with them slaves and things like gold and ivory. They're heading to places like Barbados or Jamaica, and our trade goods are enslaved men, women and children, gold and ivory. Ultimately, these slaves tended to come mostly from West Africa, where they were held in slave factories before they set sail, and they were sold in the West Indies and the rest of the Americas. Now, conditions obviously on the Middle Passage were really horrible, and quite often the enslaved people died from mistreatment or disease, but we'll talk about that more in a bit more detail later on. The slaves were very valuable for the British, and they did lead to African profit as well, because they were sold at auction upon arrival. The plantations in the West Indies relied on them as workers, which we've already talked about, and there was quite a lot of them travelling from this area. Then we take the Homeward Passage, okay, which is up in green there, along to Great Britain again, and we're taking things that are grown on the plantations. It's the final stage of the triangular trade, and you have things like sugar, coffee, rum, rice, tobacco and cotton, all being grown on the plantations under slave labour. Sugar, very expensive in Europe. It's a very valuable commodity, but the climate on the plantations in the West Indies makes it perfect to grow there, so that's being exploited by the Europeans. Tobacco and things like that as well, making a lot of money for Britain, and a huge textile industry part for the cotton and things as well. So this is the information that you need. If we go and highlight the kind of key bits, so you need Sierra Leone, you need the Gold Coast bit, you need the Congo and Angola, and then you need the stuff that's in the red box. You need Great Britain as well, Barbados and Jamaica, and the stuff in the yellow box, and then the stuff in the green box to fill in your map. You might also want to mark on it where each of the kind of bits were, so we know that this bit is the outward passage, so I would put an O there, and you could write it if you wanted. This part is the middle passage, so I'd put an M, and this part is the homeward passage, so I would put an H, and you can name them if you want as well. So just a wee bit more information about each of the stages and things about this. The large ports in Britain acted as the beginning and the end of the triangular trade route. They would come from ports like Bristol, Liverpool and Glasgow, loaded with these goods to trade with the agents or with the tribal leaders themselves in Africa. In recent years, it's also been discovered that Glasgow was actually a major trading port, especially for things like tobacco, and they would send ships to Africa to trade for slaves to take to the West Indies to get this as well. It's estimated that roughly about 5,300 voyages left from Liverpool alone during the slave trade. Ships had to have a good crew to ensure basically an efficient journey, which included having ship surgeons, carpenters to keep fixing things, sailmakers, a good captain who could navigate the seas. Quite often they would have to have a handler to deal with the Africans and things as well. So a lot of different people involved in this. Stage 2 then of triangular trade can be broken up into two sections. You've got the capture of the slaves, which we'll talk about in more detail later on, and then we've got the transporting them across the Middle Passage to the plantations. The time it took for the British ships to actually reach the coast of Africa was obviously dictated by the weather. Usually they left Britain between July and September, and they would arrive in Africa by the end of the following April. Now remember, these ships are sailing ships, they're not steam engines, they're having to go by the weather and the route, so it does take them quite a number of months to get there. Roughly about 11 months to get from Britain to Africa at this point in time. When the ships arrived in Africa, they get the slaves in one of two ways. Either they go to agents who were called factors. These are people who lived at the African ports, who basically acted like dealers of African slaves. They would have a network of people who could collect the slaves and then sell them on. And the other option was going from coast to sort of coast area across Western Africa and just buying as many slaves as they could from different places. So either they would go to one agent who would fill their ship, or they would go to a number of them who would then fill the ship over time. So anytime it could take weeks or a couple of months to actually fill the ship as well. Okay, so what you should now do is make a copy of this grid, or if you decide to do it as a mind map, do it as a mind map and make a copy of it. Or if you're opting to do this as just a heading with information, do that, put this as a heading, and we're going to use the next couple of bits of information on the next slide to fill in kind of a summary about the different stages of the triangular trade. So key points of information that we want, we're going to say ships involved in the triangular trade travelled from Britain to West Africa, then to the West Indies, and finally back to Britain. So quite a bit to write on this one. On the first part of the trip, the outward passage, ships carried cloth, metal pots and pans and guns to trade. These goods were traded for slaves. There were two ways to organise slaves on board ships: loose and tight packing, and this depended on the ship owner's preferences. On the next part of the voyage, the middle passage, Africans were carried to the West Indies to be sold. I know there's a lot on this bit, but this is the only note we're writing them. The slaves were sold in an auction. The ships then left the West Indies to bring goods back to Europe, such as sugar and tobacco, and this was called the homeward passage. And then the raw materials would then be turned into manufactured goods to be sold in Europe or trade with Africa, and the route would start again. Okay, so maybe pause the video there, either fill in your mind map or fill in your grid. If you're printing the grid to fill it in, that's fine, or if you've made a copy of it in your jotter, that's fine, and then move to the next slide for your assignment task for the week. So your assignment task for this lesson, task 1 for this week, is to do this fill in the blanks quiz. It'll come up as a quiz, but you can see the questions here as well. So you're looking to kind of fill them in. In Britain, slavers loaded up with blank and blank, so let's fill in the answers to it. Slave ships left Europe and headed for, so where are they going? These were used to buy what in Africa? One of the main ports for slavers in Britain was, so name one of the ports. European powers set up blank blank on the coast to collect slaves, so what was the place they were held in called? Many slaves came from the blank coast, so decide which one it is. The voyage from Africa to the Americas was called the something something, so that middle section, what's it called? This voyage was across the what ocean? In the West Indies, the African slaves were sold at what? In the West Indies, the ships were loaded up with Name 2 things. The ships were then sailed back across the ocean to, where are they going? And the ships on this voyage made high what? So decide what the fill in the blanks are and put it up onto the team. If you've got any questions, email or put a message into your team and let your teacher know, and let us know how you're getting on.